Stop leaving your garbage on the ground.
Hi, I'm your local Scottish Resistance main. Yes, the one who ruins your pub experience one poorly placed trap at the time. And I'm here to talk about a very important subject. Well, it's actually not that important. I mean, there are bigger topics like keeping random crits, the casual versus competitive gap, what's the future of TF2, is the game dying, but you know what, I'm not going to cover any of that. There's like thousands of people who do that stuff daily. So instead, let's talk about the Scottish Resistance, because I never talk about that weapon here. Well, I guess you people want something more specific. It's more or less the idea of what makes the Scottish Resistance so, well, underused or not very popular. And I mean, you're probably thinking either it's because of this weapon existing, or maybe you think it's because the weapon is actually pretty bad. Well, the answer is a bit of both, but because this is a channel devoted to the Scottish Resistance, I have to overanalyze it now. So I guess to start, we might as well start off by talking about dem attributes, which are right here. And I mean, everyone's initial impressions are always, wow, that's a lot of blue stats. This weapon must be a direct upgrade over stock. Well, sure, there's a high quantity, but is it high quality? And the answer is basically, well, 3 of them are pretty much just average quality. One of them doesn't have much quality since it gets heavily gimped by the one negative stat, and the other attribute is, quite frankly, not really that much of a positive attribute and more of a neutral one.
What?
For some of you, you probably want a better explanation on why I'm calling this a neutral attribute. Well, for starters, let's think about attributes just in general. When something's a positive attribute, it usually represents something that's supposed to be better than the stock version, like, say, a 25% faster firing speed. Like, it's obviously going to fire faster than the stock version, so that's quite clearly positive. While the negative ones are, well, something that are very obviously a downgrade, like a 0.8 second longer arm time, which it's really easy to say, yeah, that's obviously worse than stock. But selective detonation, it's kind of tricky because really, for some people, this can be seen as a real huge strength, but for other people, they may not like the idea of, well, yeah, I have to look at my own bombs to detonate them, and there are people who actually don't like this. So in general, this is more of an attribute just describing how you're supposed to detonate the sticky bombs. And now we have to talk about, well, the one downside, which has a lot of quality. That dreaded 0.8, well, it's technically 1.02 according to the wiki, seconds longer bomb arm time. You know, what makes sticky spamming really painful. Because of a lack of reliable sticky spamming, this weapon mainly becomes known for sticky trapping. And because it's mainly known for sticky trapping, it gets this kind of reputation.
My friend here's just a little defensive.
That's right, the Scottish Resistance is more of a defensive weapon. It's not really that offensive, it doesn't like offending people. It's more very defensive about itself. You gotta take your time, plan stuff out, and stop those people from capping the objective. They're probably thinking in theory, well, that's a very good niche for this weapon. It's just the more defensive variant of the stock sticky bomb launcher. You can just use it in defensive situations, but you can't use it in offensive ones. A pretty good trade-off. But just because something works in theory doesn't necessarily mean it works in practice, and honestly, it's more important that it works in practice than it works in theory. So I guess the real question to ask is, does the Scottish Resistance work in practice? In which, well,
it's complicated.
Depending who you ask, you're gonna get a completely different answer for if the Scottish Resistance is viable or not. However, what I found really important to realize when looking at all these responses that people gave out for the Scottish Resistance is that context matters. And by context, I mean context of which scene of TF2 they're playing in. And I guess you're thinking that there are 2 major contexts I'm probably talking about right now. The casual scene, like 12v12 pubs, casual mode, community servers, where it's just all casual nonsense. And then you got that ultra strict, ultra structured community 6s, or just competitive in general, where people are actually trying to do the objective. And depending on which scene you're in, your opinion on the Scottish Resistance really changes. So what's the general consensus for the Scottish Resistance in, say, 6s? Well, for those people, the Scottish Resistance is pretty much useless. For multiple reasons. First of all, it's important to realize that Community 6's, where B. Forney, leader of the Golden State Warriors of TF2 plays, it's generally a more faster paced environment. They ban weapons that will usually slow the pace down, and while the Scottish Resistance isn't banned, it's a weapon that usually takes a more slower, a more passive, and a more methodical approach, compared to, say, the stock Sticky Bomb Launcher, where you can just dish out high damage at the start of a mid-fight, which can give a team an early advantage. But maybe you're thinking, well, Demo Man isn't always about sticky spam. Sticky traps are pretty important and competitive. Yeah, you're right, but do you really want to switch between the Scottish Resistance and the stock all the time? Or you could just stick to using the stock, which it can sticky trap. It can sticky trap pretty well. And what about last holds? That's a pretty defensive situation. Yeah, maybe, but here's the other thing about the Scottish Resistance and why it's not that good in 6s and, in general, more controlled environments. And it's this idea that people are usually communicating, and they're usually going to call out and be more cautious for things like sticky traps and the positioning of the enemy team. Which means, at best, you can get kills with the Scottish Resistance, but usually it's just there to stall the enemy team, but they're just going to see your traps and destroy them or just avoid them or bait you into deading them really early, so better off just using the stock Sticky Bomb Launcher and just doing that sticky spam damage if you really need to do something in a last-ditch defensive situation. So, I guess to summarize why the Scottish Resistance isn't that popular in competitive 6s, it's a weapon that usually requires a more slower and a more methodical playstyle. However, this is the scene where everything's more fast-paced. Sticky traps aren't as good for getting kills compared to sticky spamming or just getting kills with your grenade launcher. And most importantly, the fact that there's a longer arm time, you lose that ability to deal out consistent damage that can become very useful in mid-fights and in most situations to really help your team pick off targets. So what about the casual scene? Well, generally their opinions range from it's average to it's really good. And one of the major reasons why it gets this reputation in a casual environment is for the opposite reason why it gets a bad reputation in a competitive one. It's this idea that pubs, there isn't much coordination or communication, and they're chaotic in nature. And because of all this chaos going on, it's really easy to forget that there's a sticky trap right underneath you. And quite frankly, it makes sense that the Scottish Resistance is more viable in a pub compared to, say, 6s. It's because when the Scottish Resistance was first added, back in 2009, I don't think the TF2 devs really cared about the competitive scene and, oh, what do the competitive 6s players think about the Scottish Resistance? No, they only cared about pubs back then. The Scottish Resistance was built to work in pubs. Outside of that, it's So as long as you combine to the more methodical playstyle, do some multitasking, some planning ahead, you can hard carry with the Scottish Resistance in pubs, because with all the chaos going around, people will ignore that sticky trap right underneath them. And however, this highlights a pretty significant problem with the Scottish Resistance in the sense that the moment you start realizing that there's sticky traps all over the place, this is when things start to really fall off with this weapon. And really why people will also tend to go near the it's average, because it could also get really hard countered. All it takes is basic awareness, a quickie bomb launcher, short circuit, or scorch shot, and congratulations, you have now countered the Scottish Resistance Demo Man. So basically, the key to using the Scottish Resistance in pubs is not only to be a master at predicting stuff, but you also gotta hope that the team is kinda dumb and not paying attention to things. The more alert the enemy is to where your traps are, the harder it is to use the Scottish Resistance, to the point where you effectively have to play 5D chess just to get a kill. As weird as this might sound, I'm gonna compare the SR to the Phlogistinator. They're both weapons that dominate against average to low skilled players, but the moment you go against really high skilled players, these weapons aren't that effective. But even in those situations where the Scottish Resistance is supposed to be dominant, why is it still pretty unpopular? Well, this is where we're gonna compare the Scottish Resistance to the other Demoman unlocks, because I don't think it's fair to necessarily just compare to the stock Sticky Bomb Launcher, because stock is supposed to always be the best choice for Demoman. It's supposed to be better than the SR. So let's compare SR versus, well, its polar opposite, the QBL, or supposed polar opposite. Well, the Quickie Bomb Launcher is better for destroying enemy sticky bombs. I know this firsthand because they're the thing that I always see whenever I go on a roll. You can also play generally more aggressive with the Quickie Bomb Launcher than you can with the Scottish Resistance because arm times, and the QBL is better for sticky sniping, but it's not as good for trapping. How about SR versus, well, Demo Knight in general? Well, this is a really weird one to compare because I'm effectively comparing apples to oranges because Demo Knight is its own special thing. Honestly, I think SR versus Demo Knight in general is a better example of polar opposite playstyles than the QBL because Demo Knight, you're usually just trying to charge into battle and get into the face of your enemy, while the SR you're trying to play as back and as passive as possible. What about the Sticky Jumper versus the SR? Well, the Sticky Jumper is a meme, and we all know the TF2 community loves their memes. With the Sticky Jumper, you're usually just doing very crazy strats, usually more reliant on your grenade launcher. I mean, when you're using the Scottish Resistance, you kinda have to be more reliant with your grenade launcher. But at least with the Sticky Jumper, you have insane mobility. With the Scottish Resistance, you got trapping but as discussed before, once the enemy knows about your traps, they're basically useless. At least with the Sticky Jumper, you can just fly away as a retreat strat. Also, yes, in general, you can play more aggressively with the Sticky Jumper because of all that mobility you got. And if you have been keeping up with these three comparisons, then you probably noticed the common theme, which is they're all more aggressive than the SR. And this brings me to what I think is the big reason why the Scottish Resistance isn't that popular. In a game like TF2 where there's a lot of weapons that promote getting in, playing very aggressive, the SR is a more passive one where you have to take your time, plan stuff out. A lot of people just don't like doing that because it can be kind of boring when you could just be going in and market gardening people. I guess what I'm trying to say is the Scottish Resistance is not spectator friendly. It's not a bad weapon, it's just a more slower, methodical weapon that can be very punishing if done incorrectly. It's effectively the Ottawa Senators of Demomen secondaries. It requires a strict system that can be very punishing if done incorrectly, and generally people aren't that interested in it.
Ways, and you can have a lot of stickies all over the place. Valve needs to buff it. It's a pretty terrible weapon, but it has some cool abilities. I wish it was just a little bit more viable.
Yeah, it's one of those weapons. Very interesting concept. It's just in design, it's complete garbage. So they need to fix that a little bit.
And now here's the part where I get to address something that might be somewhat controversial: the idea of buffing the Scottish Resistance. Now, this is a subject I have dabbled around in the past. However, since the last time I ever talked about this on this channel, my views have somewhat changed significantly on the whole idea of buffing the Scottish Resistance, based off feedback and stuff I've seen around the community since. And here's generally how I feel now when it comes to the whole discussion of buffing the Scottish Resistance. It's the idea that I can't come up with a single solution and say, yeah, this is, if you make these changes like this, this, and this, the SR is perfect. That's not true. Everything I suggest is purely based off like theory crafting and what I think would work, but ultimately the only way I would ever know if any of my suggestions would work is if I actually implemented them and playtested them within a controlled environment. I mean, this idea can really apply to any weapon in the game. Ultimately, it comes down to how it plays out in a controlled environment, which I've never actually playtested with any of my ideas. So for you people who are expecting me to come up with this, oh, this is the ultimate way to fix the Scottish Resistance, these are the problems, this is how we fix it, I don't actually have that. I have a bunch of side suggestions or like ideas, but I'm not saying any of them are perfect. Ultimately, it will come down to playtesting and not just one session. I'm talking about maybe like 6 months of playtesting something, because you gotta let people get used to the weapon. Maybe once they get used to it, they'll find exploits, so it's a pretty long process, and that's why I don't want to say anything I come up with is the solution. It's just an idea. Before I begin suggesting these ideas, we need to take a step back, and maybe you don't even think the Scottish Resistance needs buffing, and that's totally fine. In my opinion, I could see room for improvement, and I'd be open to changes to make the Scottish Resistance better for everyone. I mean, the current Scottish Resistance, it's not bad as I said, it's just very frustrating to use. And that's kind of okay. Maybe that's how it's meant to be, but I'm always open to looking to improve something, so I figured why not, let's think about some ideas. And if you're against that and you're really stubborn and hard-pressed that the SR is fine as it is, sure, that's fine. I have nothing wrong with that. So yeah, here are some ideas that I've had for how they could buff the Scottish resistance. Once again, I'm not saying any of these ideas are perfect and that, oh, if they implement this, the weapon's perfect, no problems, it's fine, it's viable. No, it's just an idea. Maybe they'll playtest and it turns out it's a horrible idea. And I guess I'll start off with the one that I suggested way back in January, and that was the idea of introducing damage ramp up. So why did I suggest damage ramp up? Well, initially, I was looking for an attribute that would mimic similar to the longer arm time, but slightly better, and effectively, that's what the damage ramp up was. It basically made sticky spamming really bad. That's why it was implemented back in 2014 briefly, but removed because demo players complained that they couldn't dish out consistent damage anymore. However, the difference between damage ramp up and the arm time is that with damage ramp up, at least you get a bit of damage, and most importantly, and something that I've come to realize, it makes destroying enemy sticky bombs a lot more reliable and opens up more possibilities. As I said earlier, the 0.8 second arm time really gimps the ability to destroy bombs with the SR, and ultimately the quickie bomb launcher just does it better, so it was kind of a pointless attribute. By adding this damage ramp up, sure, you lose the consistent damage again of the sticky spamming, but now you have more abilities in terms of destroying enemy sticky bombs. Now, some people were opposed to this because they thought, well, maybe that's too much sticky spam. Maybe a little bit of sticky spam is too much sticky spam for the SR, and that's fine. That's why, for my other ideas, I kind of decided to keep the arm time. However, could you reduce it down to 0.6? Now, this was an idea that I saw first suggested by a guy named Eckstein. Maybe you know who he is, maybe you don't. But he suggested that the idea of that reducing the arm time to 0.6 seconds would make the Scottish resistance slightly better at longer ranges because there's that extra 0.2 seconds to arm, and I mean, technically the original Scottish resistance was 0.6, so effectively could we revert it back, which means removing the 25% faster firing speed. However, some people like that because it allows you to output your bombs faster, but maybe a 25% faster reload speed would output your bombs faster. Think about it this way. It's kind of pointless to have a faster firing speed when you keep on losing your clip instantly, because you gotta constantly output bombs because you gotta make traps on the fly. And maybe having that 25% faster reload speed will allow you to have your sticky bombs out faster. Maybe, that's just an idea. And plus, I've noticed in a lot of situations, it would be really nice if the SR could reload just a bit faster. Then maybe you're thinking, well, why not just increase the clip size to 14? Technically, it's a bit faster if you just have all 14 bombs out instead of having to go through the reload animation to get back the last 6. If you're in a situation where you have to output all 14 bombs with the current Scottish resistance, you're guaranteed to have to go through that reload cycle at least 6 times, which can be a big pain, especially in tight situations where not only you have to consider that they have to arm those bombs, so maybe having just a clip size of 14 would be a lot nicer. Maybe combine the 25% faster reload speed with the clip size of 14, scrap the 25% faster firing speed and the ability to destroy enemy sticky bombs, and hey, maybe that's a possibility. It would effectively make outputting your bombs a lot more reliable, and you're really trading off the consistent damage that is super valuable, so I could see that as a somewhat decent trade-off. But then you're thinking maybe, well, if it's all about outputting bombs as fast as you can, shouldn't we be keeping the 25% faster firing speed? In which case, if I had to choose between the faster reload speed and the clip size of 14, I'd probably go with the reload speed because you can just get your bombs back really fast and then you can output them really fast. Sure, you have to go through the reload, but at least the reload will be faster. Maybe some of you are still thinking, but I really wanted to be able to destroy enemy sticky bombs with the SR. Well, that's where we have to go back to damage ramp up because I think that's the best option if you really want to enable the ability to destroy enemy sticky bombs on the SR. But if we want to work with the arm time, then I would suppose you'd have to reduce the arm time down to 0.6 and then remove the 25% faster firing speed, in which case you could just replace that with maybe the 25% faster reload speed. I mean, there's you can mix and match stuff. I'm curious to see what people have in mind. Maybe there's another idea you have that could enable the ability to destroy enemy sticky bombs. And yeah, that's pretty much all the ideas I have. Once again, these are just ideas. I'm not saying if they do this, the SR is perfectly fine. Okay, this is the end of the video. I'm gonna go back to ruining pub experiences one poorly placed sticky trap at a time now.